Well, good evening, gang. We're so glad to have you here tonight. You get to hear my voice instead of Tom saying hello. Tom and Susan are at some event this evening, and then in the morning they hop it off to Detroit to visit with some friends, and be gone all week. He's coming back, I think, on Monday week. They're going to make a little side trip up into Canada, so sounds like a nice time of the year to do that. I hope they have a good time. So tonight I think I will do the hello and goodbye, and John Beesley will come and give our presentation, and maybe next week he'll do the hello, goodbye, and who do we have coming and speaking next week? Oh, Alan Brunton is going to come and talk to us about lessening our stress, which is probably a good subject we might all like to hear. And he's going to talk about using music to do that. I think I discovered that pretty early in life. Music was just a very relaxing thing to sort of wind those tight muscles down a bit and relax. So that's next week, and then Tom has the next week out scheduled. Rob Olson's going to talk to us about some ethics-related subjects, and that'll be always interesting to hear. We always love John to come and talk. He's clear and succinct, and he generally has a good knowledge of what he's talking about. And so we'll have him speak, and then, of course, as usual, we will ask him questions. I'm sorry?
There it is.
Yeah, down to about June 17, meeting 368. The world in 2037. So he's going to patch out 20 years and give us some guesstimations of what things might be like then. But John's going to talk to us about neoliberal free market. You can read the program. I'm not going to do a Tom and read it all off, but we'll have the presentation. See, I've past the offering plate. We've done that. Thank you for your $3. And be sure and be kind to our server. She appreciates that. And it gives us a room without having to pay a fee for it, which helps. And then when John's finished, of course, as I mentioned, we'll do the questions. And then John will get to set, and we'll get up and make our great words of wisdom for up to 5 minutes. Please don't take 15 and talk about how to catch trout. Stay on the subject and keep us interested in what you're saying. So when we're all finished with that, well, John can come up and give us some response to anything we say that might get under his fingernails, if we manage to do that, and start closing it down, and we'll shut it off and give the room back to him and go to the house. So glad you were able to come out tonight. Welcome to the party, and enjoy your food and enjoy John's presentation. The question is John ready to come up and blab, or is he still eating?
No, you need to talk more.
I need to talk more. Blabbity, 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 blab. I don't know what all Tom and Susan. Announcements. Does anybody have announcements to make tonight?
Make one up.
Hank's not here. And looks like we have no announcements tonight. I don't really care to read all this stuff off of the program. I can do some of that. You know, all of you who are here tonight have heard John speak, so I don't really need to rattle off all of his great credentials. They're good. And his experience with Xerox was great. Something a lot of people would have traded for gladly, to be in the shoes he was in. And at the time he was there when they were doing a lot of the innovation and a lot of the new products. Most of it went super well. One thing I know he reminded me of tonight was they created the windows, which the company did not want. They didn't think it was worthwhile. They didn't want to develop it, and it was seen out in Palo Alto. Anyways, you know, Microsoft ended up with it and replaced the old DOS system with the Windows, and it's on whatever 92% of the computers in the world. It even runs on a lot of the Apples now, which first had it locked out. But they created some wonderful things, great printers. I was telling John tonight, I worked at an insurance company downtown back in the early 60s. They had one copier in the whole office, and it was a Xerox. It was a big old cabinet, maybe 4 feet long. And when it'd make copies, the light and the thing would go down. You'd see it passing. Zoom. Very slow. It probably took about a minute to get the first copy out of the copier. But it was a great thing to have, because before that we had those old lithograph machines that used the slimy paper, and when they printed it was smelly. You didn't want to touch it and get it on your fingers until it dried. And so Xerox made a great step forward with that. And the copiers kept getting faster and better, and I couldn't tell you how many Xerox copiers I've used, but they've always been great to me. And little did I know back in that stage in life that John was a big part of that. So we've had some people here in our group that have been involved in quite a few neat things, and John has definitely. So I'm gonna sit down and shut up. I've blabbed and rattled, and
Thank you, Jim.
turn it over to him, and I hope he's gotten enough food in his body.
I do.
Mindless rattle.
Well, thank you for coming tonight. And, as usual, my wife is eternally grateful for taking me out and boring you all. She's at home enjoying herself doing something or the other, like knitting or baking or something like that. Anyway, I've been eaten and I'm now lubricated with Peroni, which I can recommend. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about the neoliberal free market miasma. So how did I get interested in this topic in general? Well, in the early 1990s, I was round at a friend's house, and the topic of NAFTA came up. You know, the North American free trade agenda. And I expressed some negativity to such things. And a chap there actually turned out to be an ambassador of some sort. And he said it was going to be very good. And he said, Adam Smith, Adam Smith. As if saying Adam Smith really, said everything you need to say about it. Well, of course, I have something to say about Adam Smith, apart from the fact he was a Scotsman who wanted to now break away from the poor old United Kingdom. But anyway, so Adam Smith, of course, collected the views of other Scottish economists, such as David Hume and others. And about the time of the American Revolution, he published a book called The Wealth of Nations.
Yeah.
Which is really the foundation of this liberal idea, free market, free trade, and laissez-faire, which means no regulations. In fact, what the notion is, if you have regulations, it impedes commerce and is negative. And in fact, under its hidden hand, it actually leads to optimum results for everybody. And another individual in this firmament of classical economists was a Frenchman called J.B. Say, and his notion was that when you create supply, you pay for materials and labor, and that payment, of course, creates the demand. And so that equals out. And that's what also tends to the equilibrium. And of course, the notion is that everybody in this situation is an equal economic actor, which of course is untrue, but that's part of the idea. The idea really is also bound up with the idea of self-reliance and individual responsibility, because you are all individual economic actors. And so there's a natural outcome of this, which is anti-welfare payments, because that apparently destroys initiative and so on. Now, of course, there always will be people that fall by the wayside, and in those years, there were charities provided by the church and volunteers and other such organizations. Now, the history of provision, and I'm really talking about tonight, you know, you won't accuse me of being anti-American because I'm anti-UK as much as I am anti-American in this talk. Both are equally guilty. Anyway, the notion of social provision in England, it goes back nearly 500 years, because as you know, Henry VIII wanted to get divorced, and of course Catholic religion didn't allow it. So he said basically, well, to hell with the Pope and everything, and I'll have my own religion, the Protestant faith. And so he sacked all the monasteries and the churches, he took all their wealth. And so that put paid to the Catholic charities, which of course still operate today. And so there were poor laws and provision made, had to be made by the state. And so in the Elizabethan era, you had poor laws where in 1537, which provided for general relief out of taxation. And so times went on. Many hundreds of years later, in the middle of the Second World War, an individual called William Beveridge, who was a Liberal MP, devised the welfare state, which was the social provision of health, education, and housing. And that started up in 1948. And I was one of the prime beneficiaries of all these three things. So in the US, of course, there was no national provision of welfare until the late 1920s and early 1930s, when, of course, the economy collapsed, and to such a degree that the provision of the churches and insurances just couldn't cope. And so that's when, by sort of accident almost, that Delano Roosevelt, of course, introduced a partial welfare system and basically government intervention. And of course, later on in the Lyndon Johnson came along and devised increasing such provisions in the Great Society programs, introducing Medicaid and Medicare. Now, this whole welfare system and the system that developed really driven by Keynesian economics, which was government intervention from the 1940s, 50s, and into 60s, even early 70s. There was a pushback of this because it offended, the morality and dogma of the right wing. Now, at the same time, in the late 60s and 70s, we had huge rising inflation caused by two factors. And the one was the Vietnam War, spending on the Vietnam War, together with the social programs, and it wasn't covered by the resources provided. And also the second thing was the huge, the formation of the OPEC oil cartel, which pushed up the price of oil by a factor of 10 during the 70s. And so against, of course, you had this huge rise in inflation, and of course the working people, of course, gradually saw their salaries being reduced by this inflationary pressure. And so the trade unions, which then were fairly strong, aimed to sort of try to rectify this situation. And you know, there was sort of quite a lot of, especially in the UK, industrial strife. And so it was a prime opportunity for the opponents of what you might call state intervention to blame the trade unions for this rise in inflation, because they claimed the trade unions were greedy and their wage demands really were the cause of inflation, whereas typically they weren't. They were trying to keep up. In fact, actually the average pay started to fall with respect to the GDP from the mid-70s, so they really have never caught up. Now, so by the end of the 70s, you had this anti-union and blame situation. And in that situation, of course, entered Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, you know, two birds of a feather, really, with the same ideology. Now, this ideology really is based on the controlling class interests, coated by false dogma and specious economics. And that's what I'm going to talk about, the dogma and specious economics tonight. So and of course I call this the rebirth of liberal economics. Now, liberalism really means free trade, freedom, okay? And so liberalism is now meant to be left-wing in terms of social views, but in classical economic terms, it does mean free market, free trade, basically the ideology of Adam Smith and J.B. Say. So what was this liberalism? Well, the notion really is that you must eliminate regulations, reduce the size of the government, reduce welfare spending, oppose minimum wage laws and any increase in the minimum wage, and eliminate government agencies. And the ones that have been under attack are Commerce, HUD, Energy, Education, the EPA, and the Interior Department. They've all been penciled in for being eliminated. Now, our famous governor, Perry, couldn't remember the agency that he now heads. Ironically, the Energy Department. Such was his brain power. But these same people will always want to increase the size of defense spending and, of course, have austerity for everything else. So they're mad keen to go to war, but not mad keen on any social programs. That's the way their mind works. Now, the other factor is, because of this, the income of the 1% with respect to the gross national product since this pushback has grown in the USA in about the middle of the 1970s. The 1% were taking about 70% of the income. Well, since then, it's gone way up, way over 20%. Really way back to the way it was in the 1920s. So they've done very well. And the truth to tell is that 99%, the average wage, has really, with respect to the GDP, has gone down. It has not kept up with the growth. So really, the spoils, if you want, of the economy have gone mostly to the 1%. And I'm afraid the 99% have been left somewhat bereft. So, now the other thing that went on, of course, is especially in the United Kingdom, is really the pushback of welfare payments. We saw that especially in the government after 2010. You had a rampant denigration of the poor. They were castigated as being scroungers, work shy, taking money off the hard-working people. And of course, they didn't deserve these benefits. There were all kinds of private gangs set up to do work assessment. And there's a British film out now called I, Daniel Blake, which details what happens to such people when they have to go through this rigmarole of work assessments and get denied benefit or anything else. Because of course we're under austerity. The other component, of course, is this desire for privatization. And so in the UK, we've had privatization of most public assets. And you can privatize them. And it turns out that while the British state shouldn't own them, it turns out that most of these assets are owned by foreign states, like the German state, the French state. The French state owns the power. In terms of, the London airport is owned by the Spanish, and the water is owned by the Germans. The transport system, you've got a bus, it's owned by the Germans. It's so that's what happens when you privatize. Basically, it gets sold off. And it has to be sold off, as I'll explain in a minute. And so the other thing that happened was the destruction of the manufacturing base in the UK and the USA. Major industries, of course, that were in the state hands were just shut down. And of course, when you had the recessions, of course, that pushed a lot of businesses out of business. And then came globalization, which is pushed by the major international cartels chasing the cheap labor. And so what you've had in the US, you have this huge Rust Belt form, especially up in the northern tier. And what it's done in both countries, having destroyed your manufacturing base, ever since the 1980s, you've had a huge, cumulative, ever-growing trade deficit. Now, this has to be paid for. Now, what I call phony economists will tell you how wonderful it is, this globalization, because look at all the cheap goods we're getting. It's never mentioned that these have to be paid for. It's kind of like running up a credit card, living high on the hog, spending your credit card, but the day comes when you hit the limit. Has to be paid for. So the other thing, so this trade deficit has to be paid for by the sale of government securities, the sale of government assets, and the sale of businesses. That's what happens when you run this huge trade deficit over globalization. So when you're doing this, you have a basic loss of sovereignty. You lose control of your economic engine, which I would say should be severe concern. Now in England, of course, there seems to be no concern. We're quite happy. Apparently Theresa May recently announced that she would have an industrial policy, but it would have to be funded by China, of all things. Now, when you run this huge trade deficit, it amounts to trillions. I mean, in fact, the cumulative is something like getting on for 18 to 20 trillion. So though this money comes back, we've had a cheap money because of this return, really, of the trade deficit money. And so it comes back, and of course, as I say, buying government securities and so on and so on. But a lot of it goes into the hedge funds and so-called shadow banking system. And it's that money, this flood of money coming back into the shadow banking system, that's caused these financial bubbles, the dot-com bubble and the housing bubble. So that's been the outcome. And so basically, since the 80s, since all this miasma started, you've had a recession roughly every 8 years. And those that have lived through it know that these recessions caused by this bubbles are getting longer and deeper. And by the way, there's going to be a huge one coming next, because really nothing has been done to change anything. And so the total cumulative debt is roughly getting on towards 200% of the GDP. Now the majority, over 2/3 of it, 120% of the GDP, was run up by the finance industry, really on a giant gambling scheme, what I call the Wall Street casino, and of course the City of London too. And so that's given rise to wild speculation, which ended with this gambling on derivatives, which had a nominal value of something like $60 trillion. I mean, it is unbelievable. And so the free market ideology boasts about the fact that there will be it will run unimpeded, of course, and the outcome will be an optimum allocation of resources. Well, that's interesting. Happens to be untrue. The reality is, with this wild gambling schemes going on, and of course the Federal Reserve pumped tons of money into the banking system to keep it afloat. Not much of that money went out of the banking system. In fact, remained inside the banking system. So there was no proper allocation of resources. The other in my mind, there's a total misdirection of resources that this country badly needs. And so in England, of course, a similar situation, only worse. In fact, the financial sector is about 20% of the entire economy. And I think it's totally misallocated. You don't need to spend that amount on financial services. And so basically, with this financial sector really running wild, you have a situation which I call profiting without producing. And that's been the major problem of the UK and the USA, profiting without producing. And of course, in this financial sector, you've had every kind of criminality going on. And the banks have been almost every year now, they've been fined hundreds of millions of dollars because of this. So what's gone on is money laundering Russian money, anyone's money that wants drug money, cartel money. You've had tax evasion on a grand scale. You've had interest rate rigging. You've had mis-selling of products, and they tell you it's going to be like an insurance, and in fact it doesn't insure you for anything. You've had spurious rating agencies, which call everything AAA, and it was garbage. And of course, you had this gambling and corruption in every market. Basically, every market is rigged, no matter what market you're in. But also what's happened is you've had a corruption of the support professionals that support the financial world. The auditors, the lawyers, the accountants, the brokers, the rating agency, and even the economists have all been corrupted by this system. Because the money was so good, everybody looked the other way, pretending the crash would never happen. Of course, one of the main culprits was a guy called Joe Cassano. Now, he was the head of financial trading for AIG, which was an insurance company. He promoted these derivatives. Now, the derivatives were basically a bet, and he provided the insurance. AIG was an insurance company. It was a bet against the failure of, say, the housing market. The only problem was there was no money behind it. Zip. And so this is why Paulson had to bail out AIG to bail out Goldman Sachs, because Goldman Sachs was up to eyeballs in these derivatives. So the whole market was corrupted. Now, supply side economics, basically it says we give massive tax cuts to the corporations and the upper bracket individuals, and this will be invested in the economy. Well, basically speaking, it's never invested in the productive economy, as I've just explained. It's really gambled in the non-productive economy. And so we have trillions of dollars, in fact, held offshore that they don't come back. And so these are held in non-productive assets, especially housing. And so housing in London, in New York, and Vancouver are basically piggy banks for the world's elite, 1% of the world. The Russians, the Chinese, the Gulf Arabs, buy these houses and apartments in London, and these apartments in Hyde Park, they go from 50 to 100 million a piece. In fact, the English 1% can't afford to live anymore. They can't afford it because the world's elite billionaires have bought them out, so to speak. So, in fact, it's got to the point where the average house price in London is 12 times the average income. So it's unaffordable. Now, in general, in the most affordable area in England is 6 times the average income. And so it's really kind of destroyed really the living standards. It's just not possible really to be working and living in London. Even graduates, medical people can't live in London anymore because of this, because we've let this financial criminals really take over things. Now, we have also seen what's called labour arbitrage. Jack Welch, who was CEO of GE, General Electric, he wanted to run the barge economy. What he wanted was to have his factories on a barge, sail them around the world to the cheapest location for labour, basically. Of course, but of course, he did pretty well anyway in the offshoring, what's called searching for the cheapest labour. So in the UK, we've had influx of cheap labour now from Eastern Europe. And of course in the USA we have cheap influx from Latin America, which of course, and so in London, for example, even in the outer suburbs, you have a plethora of beds in sheds, and multiple families living in houses, and so on. And of course the US has a continuation of slums because of all of this, low pay and so on. So basically what all this does when you search for the cheapest labor around the world is, and you bring this cheap labor in, you undercut the living standards of the indigenous population, and they've grown angry, which is why I say you had a peasant revolution. You had a Brexit vote in England and a vote for Trump over here, because at long last the peasant population have revolted. Now they've turned to the right wing, mind you, but that's why we've had this revolt. Now, there's been negative social factors when you have this situation. So to take education, well, it used to be free up through university level in England. No, not so anymore. I got mine free, no more. In the US, of course, it's basically risen to the point of being unaffordable. And basically, if you want a good country, you have to have good education. It really is and you must take care of the young people. I mean, they are the future of the country. So you must have good education. Housing, well, as I say, what happened with Margaret Thatcher, there was after the war, a lot of social housing built, because people just didn't have the money. So a lot of new towns were built. Well, she decided that she wanted a property-only democracy, so she basically sold it all off and didn't permit any more social housing. So the peak home ownership peaked in 1986 at 71%. Had owned their own homes. Well, now since then, because homes have become unaffordable, it's dropped down to 61%. So we've seen this decline, in fact, over this period of neoliberalism. Healthcare. Well, goes without saying, the USA has the most expensive and the most inefficient in the world. England has the National Health Service, but it's been half privatized already, ready really to be totally sold off. Actually, that's what's the plan. Employment. Well, as people lived here in the 50s and 60s, no, in the 70s, employment was fairly stable. Well, now employment really has become very precarious. You have internships even for graduates where they work for nothing. So you have this gig economy where you actually go on the gigs of work. And in England you have this 0-hour contracts that offer you no guarantee of hours in any working week and therefore no pay. Therefore you can't rent or buy because you don't have any stable income. So what you have is loss of social cohesion. And the main disbenefits of all of this have been the young people. They really are upset, and across Europe, even now, even though Europe apparently is recovering, 20% of young people are unemployed, 20%. Which is why I want to get out of Europe. I think it's a neoliberal, austerity-crazed lunatic asylum myself. So, what is the current offer made to this peasant class who voted in Trump and probably will vote in Theresa May? Well, what they're offering really is an extreme version of neoliberalism. So this really, I mean, Hayek wrote the, as Ray knows, wrote to serfdom, but really what they're offering really is the true road to serfdom. And so the peasants have accepted the remedy of any downturn and recessions as austerity, which makes sense to them. They say naturally if you have a downturn and you've got a loss of revenue, then we must save our money and spend less and cut back on all sorts of social programs and so on and so forth. And obviously that's the thing to do. Well, of course, it's the exact reverse. If you're in austerity, if you have a recession, you must spend, and that spending will generate wealth and get the economy going again. And in the UK, the US peasants, the UK peasants, have accepted the Labour government was responsible for overspending, and therefore the country couldn't come out of this recession because of spending. And so they regarded this, which I don't support, couldn't support the Labour government for other reasons, but that was their general the view that they accepted. And basically what they're asking to accept really is what I call reverse Robin Hood. The supply side, basically takes from the poorest and gives to the richest by tax cuts and cutting corporate tax rates and so on. So this is what the main Trump policies are. I would call them the reverse Robin Hood on steroids. And while these self-same people are claiming to be supporters of the working people, which is one of the most amazing ironies I've ever seen. So my pragmatic verdict on all of this is this setup just does not work. It just does not work. And so what's happened is, because of this neoliberal cabal, both countries are not paying their way in the world anymore. They're running up huge trade deficits. And this has been going on for 40 years. To such an extent that I think eventually even the 1% will suffer. Even the 1% will suffer. as the country declines and you have civil strife and so on and so forth. And maybe it would be too late to recover, as both countries will be asset stripped. Because when you can't pay your way in the world, you have to forego your assets to pay. That's the truth of it. This is never explained to the average people. This is what globalization does. Now, the mainsprings of what's been going on is what I call colossal greed, accompanied by colossal stupidity. Both factors. And I've worked amongst some of these elite people, and I must say there's a great dearth of intellect amongst them, lack of education, sort of unknowingly looking the other way, thinking, well, I'm okay, and damn everybody else. So let's look at the moral aspects of this, what's going on. So the 1% have so twisted the moral compass to the point where the poorest, the sickest, the most defenseless, the youngest, the oldest are demonized without adequate care or compassion. Conversely, the 1% are rewarded beyond avarice for their economic position only, and not their socio-economic benefit. So every 8 years you have this recession going on, and so this laissez-faire promotes homelessness, family breakup, criminality, illness, and death. This such social perversion can only be regarded as an evil, which is the outcome of a defective system and not just an aberrant behavior of a few. It's the system that's the problem. So my take is no just or moral society would really tolerate such evils. So let's look at the social situation. So the laissez-faire model operates without societal concern, expecting that this optimum equilibrium to return after any recession. That's what they expect. Meantime, the social damage builds up. So it's paid for, so this freedom, so-called, paid for by this immense social damage. Now, Angus Deaton, who is a Nobel Prize winner, has shown that the main beneficiaries of this have been the middle-aged white population, which show an increasing morbidity and mortality. So this talks to why the working people are so unhappy, because they're committing suicides at ever increasing rates. And so this boom and bust situation that's got worse and worse really enables the wage rates to be reset downwards. It enables older workers to be removed and replaced by younger people. In fact, amongst the middle-aged people, it reduces the ability to pay for children's education and save for the old age. So I think this peasants' revolt that we've seen confirms this social distress, which if unaddressed, especially in a country with armed to the teeth, will result in violence and catastrophe, really. That's what I think could happen. Now, on the economic side of things, well, what you've seen by the people like Adam Smith and other people, there's always a model, an economic model that's proposed that models society, but basically it always models the structure of society. I mean, back millennia ago, the model was feudalism. And then you had mercantilism, where you had rich merchants basically operating under royal cartels. And then when you had the advent of the Industrial Revolution, to make it work, you had to have this concentration of wealth. So that ushered in the capitalist system. It's really driven by the way society works and technology happens. And so when you have this concentration of capital, you have to, so the wealthy people, you know, of the day back in the late 18th century, early 19th century and so on, pooled their money and they were given shares or stocks in a business. Now they didn't want to run it or control it, they just wanted to have a share of the profits coming from it. And so they appointed a board of directors that were there to answer to the interests of the shareholders. And the directors in turn appointed the officers of the company that were hired to run the company on behalf of the shareholders. Now, as we know, Marx wrote Das Kapital, which was a critique of the capitalist system, which I'm sure you've all read and understand. And so here is my critique of what I call the basic operational flaws of this system as it has evolved. And so original flaw number one is what I call the lack of responsible ownership. So as time went on, you see, these people that were owned shares wanted to sell them. They wanted liquidity for their money. They wanted to jump out of them. So they weren't really owners as such, they became speculators. And to facilitate this, there were stock markets created where you could sell your stock and so on. So actually what would happen, especially in the 19th century, is when you had a downturn, of course, in the economy, and there were quite a few in the 19th century, business would turn down, and so profits would drop. And so people would jump out of stock and buy bonds because, in fact, when the economy declines, interest rates decline. And so your share declines. Now, conversely, because interest rates decline, the value of bonds increase. That's one of the axioms of finance. So people would jump out of stocks into bonds. And so that's basically what, like, my wife is in a balanced fund, and that's what they do. They just balance because they have a balance of stocks and shares, so they can move between the two. Now, so what this does is when they start selling off their shares, this accelerates the downturn. Okay, so because actually the bonds are worth less, the shares are worth less, and so on. And so, of course, the layoffs begin, and again, this accelerates because the buying power decreases, and so that effectively causes the market decrease and finally bottom out. So it's really this is the form of ownership really causes this. It actually accelerates downturns. So that's original flaw one. Original flaw two is that as time went on, the technology improved to the point where we now have high frequency trading. So the average life of a share these days is 22 seconds. So the notion of having responsible ownership is going clean out of the window. And so what happened is that, in fact, it's the CEOs that aren't entrepreneurs at all actually appoint. They're not only CEOs but chairmen of the board. They appoint the board, and because you basically have absent owners, they don't give a damn about the shares or the share. I mean, they're irrelevant. And so these fine people, effectively, and started in the 70s, they were given shares as part of their package. And so they've indulged in gross skimming off the top, okay, of the companies, to the point where they're earning, tens of millions, 50 millions, up to, in one case, 100 million a year. But it's really So they manipulate the shares actually to their advantage. Now the problem with this is, which is this third flaw, you have this quarter-to-quarter attention focused on what are the quarterly reports, earnings reports. So this focuses attention on the short term. And of course many of these people at the top are only there for a few years, they're given shares and they'll cash out. So they don't have any focus for the long-term interests of the company. In fact, the only people that have a long-term interest in the company are the employees who have no say in it. Okay, in fact, if they do speak up and say, you made a mistake, you have to get fired. So that's flaw 3. Flaw 4 is the hierarchical authoritarian nature of corporations, which really sets up class antagonism, where you have the management and the working people. And of course you have trade unions, which are set up, of course, so you have this natural antagonism because there's a disparity in economic interest. The working people want to get more out of the company. The top management owned shares also want to get more, so their interest is to lower wages and benefits, of course, and basically that is what's happened in spades over the last 20, 30 years. And so what does this do? Well, of course it destroys loyalty, it hampers innovation, and of course it's counterproductive, economically counterproductive when you do that. But that's exactly what's gone on. So the other original flaw is what Tom often talks about. It creates the best democracy money can buy. Because when these corporations were founded back in the late 19th century, they were chartered by states, and they were very, very heavily regulated, because the states realized what this concentration of wealth would do. And what in fact it has done. It's basically bought democracy. And of course you have SCOTUS helping the matter along. SCOTUS, of course, is the United States Supreme Court, which in 14th Amendment made corporations people. And just a few years back, Citizens United enabled corporations basically to fund parties to a basically almost unlimited extent. So this whole thing really doesn't work very well, destroys loyalty, destroys economic well-being, and basically sabotages democracy. So that's just a few flaws. So I think I added a few more than Marx ever dreamt up, but then I lived to see the outcome. So then now let's come to the basic so that's one side of the economics. So what are the basic theoretical flaws in this system? Basically, what are the flaws of Smith and Say? So they say basically supply always equals demand, and it's always brought together by price, okay, optimized by competition. Now, so this was purely expressed verbally. Now, later on, late 19th century, an individual professor in Cambridge, England, called Alfred Marshall, then produced the first diagrams, the supply-demand diagrams. And he was the tutor to Keynes in Cambridge. Now, if you turn to what's taught these days, one of the most famous books is Paul Samuelson's book on Untitled Economics. By the way, Samuelson is a relative of, I'll think of that in a minute. Anyway, so this book, Economics, 7th edition, pages 60 to 70, talks about how the supply-demand curve works. Okay, now he used the example of wheat as describing how supply demand curve works. So here I have his diagram using his same numbers. Now here on this side is the price per bushel of wheat. It goes from 0 to $5, and these are the numbers. And this is the volume produced here of millions of bushels a month. Now he then says, well, this here is the demand curve, so that up here you see at $5 a bushel, the volume is pretty low. It's 7 million bushels a month. So, but as things get cheaper and cheaper, the demand will go up, which is why you can only sell a few Rolls Royces, but thousands of Volkswagens. That's the principle. He also says that the supply curve is upward sloping. And the reason it's upward sloping, of course, these farmers are operating, they realize that they could get more money, but they had to get in more production, and they get a higher price. But that they had to bring marginal land into cultivation. It's called the law of decreasing returns. It calls this upward slope. Well, take a look at this. There's something wrong here, basically wrong. And what is wrong? Let's talk about what's logically wrong. If farmers can produce 7 million bushels, this is every month, and they're willing to offer it at a price of $2, and up here you have a group of individuals who will pay $5. Guess what will happen? The farmers won't be interested in selling it for $2. They'll sell it for $5. Does that make sense? So this demand curve, as you draw it, is a nonsense. I mean, basically, this point of supply will be up here. Now, so remember though, the problem is, so here you have these farmers. Now, it turns out the profit for these, say there are 100 farmers who are supplying. So the profit, which they're going to share out, is in fact maximized at this point, if you do the numbers. Because if they sell more, they get a lower price. Even though they sell more, if you go through the numbers, they'll get a lower income.
Not necessarily.
Oh yes, well according to this curve.
Okay.
According to this curve, as he's shown it. Because he's proving the case here. Okay. Now, in the long run, what he's saying is, well, what will happen is there's such a nice profit, you have other farmers will get into the picture, right? So what happens, well, okay, so, but they can't instantaneously enter the picture because they can only enter the picture because the existing farmers don't want to produce anymore because they're making maximum profits. So next year more farmers will show up, and so but basically the income for all of them will decline. Okay, so it's the way the market would work, bring down, but this will only happen over several seasons. It can't happen instantaneously. So of course, next season, a few more farmers will come in, a few more and a few more. Okay, but it happens over years. Now, the only problem with that, what happens if there's a glut? Mass production. Well, of course, if they produce this amount, look, the demand here for this amount is $2, and they can only produce it at $3. So you begin to see the problem. Now, the other problem, this is not really a representation of the market. Because, of course, the market is really the commodity market, and the price, the general price, is the futures price, which, of course, is 80% of which is driven by speculation. Okay, So, it's not these actors bringing together the supply and demand. It's really the true price on the market is driven by this speculative activity in the commodity market. Now, the problem with that is if you buy a future, say it's I'm going to buy it at $4 a bushel. Well, and you hold it, you have to deliver. Now, the problem with delivering it, you buy at the spot market. What's the actual price of the grain to be delivered, that week? So you can, generally speaking, you can lose a fortune on the commodity speculation. But what I'm really saying is this notion of a market operator, it doesn't. It's really a speculative market. And that's really true altogether. But let's look at what really happens in the market. See, what really happens is this. The actual supply curve is downward sloping. It's not upward sloping. Now, the reason why it's downward sloping is economies of scale. This is why, for example, you've seen it every day of the week. This is why Walmart can sell much more cheaply than a mom and pop store. In fact, Walmart will come to town and it will put every mom and pop store, and there might be 100 of them out of business. It's called the economies of scale. Now, let's look at this case, point one here. Shall we say this magic happens and we have 100 people selling something, I don't know what it is, their price is up here, P1, and their cost is C1. So they're going to make this amount of profit, each of them. Now, the problem is that they're all competing, and so if you have one more person, that will push the thing down, and they can't survive in that market. And so really, one of them will go out of business. Now, a monopoly, let's take the case of a pure monopoly. A monopoly will, because of the economies of scale, for example, what, as Jim would testify, when you're producing something, you have a fixed cost. And so the more you produce, the amount of fixed cost per item goes down. But you also have this learning curve as well. So the more you make, the cheaper it gets. Also, the more you make, you can gear up more. You can have more productive equipment. So in most things, you'll have a downward sloping supply curve. In fact, they'll never meet. The actual demand curve and the supply curve will never meet. Because a monopoly case, if he can take all the market right away from, that's why Walmart will come in, wipe out everybody in a small town. Now, because they know economies of scale, they can sell at this much, and they cost this much. Now, as you go down this curve, producing more, of course, you reach a point where cost equals price equals the cost. So you'll never go down this far. In fact, I've had a special case, they're linear, and this point, which is midway, you'll see that maximizing profit means that this profit goes up like this. So it maximizes here. So when you're selling anything under monopoly conditions, you will never go down beyond this point because you're maximizing profit. Now, basically speaking, if you look at the market, you look at Lowe's, for example, the hardware suppliers, you have 2 or 3 major outfits in most things. And these are called oligopolies. Now, their situation will fall, depending on their number, between here and here. They won't be as competitive as a pure monopoly, so they'll fall somewhere here. But these oligopolies, like Home Depot and Lowe's, will always beat out the monopoly, because they can always buy things a lot cheaper. Well, they'll put in an order for, say, lawnmowers, and they'll all buy the tens of thousands. Whereas, a mom and pop can order like 10 or something. So this is why this will always happen in the market. So this notion of neoliberal supply and demand working will never happen. Now let's look at this magic curve here in red. So, do you know what that is? Anybody? All right. Well, here you have a case where this entity doesn't pay taxes and could borrow money at the lowest rate, and that is a government entity. So their curve, because they can offer something down here. This would be their point where the cost equals the supply. So they can offer things much more. This is why the National Health Service, for example, a single payer system in England, spends $3,000 per person. In America, with all these multiple suppliers, offering $12,000 a person. That's why. It's simply the economies of scale. Now, the reason why you really don't want a single monopoly, say there was a single factory making all the ball bearings. If a fire happens, the economy will drop dead. So you tend to have oligopolies, really. And that's what we see. Look around you. You have basically, you've seen it. The mom and pop stores are really, now, you can have specialty stores, but because, now, even the so-called, say, convenience stores, like the 7-Elevens, which by the way is owned by the Japanese nowadays, they can survive because they're convenient. You can stop on, this just because people would, rather than going to the big supermarket, wandering around for 20 minutes to buy one item, it's not cost effective. Therefore, they'll stop at a convenience store, which costs more. So they're operating up here somewhere. So that's the reality of the way economics works. And it's in total negation of what's taught in school today. Okay? So this nonsense of free market and spot, still taught. This is not true. The world doesn't work that way. So this equilibrium situation, it really never happens. Now the other thing that happens, so really the market really doesn't control the supply, the price. It's really what the oligopolies or monopolies want maximized profits to be. And that's the way the price is set. Now, of course, you will get a glut now and again. Things will go unsold. Therefore, they'll lower the price, sell them off, and move on. That's true of clothing. But the general price will be the monopoly price, or oligopoly price. Now the other thing that goes on is what's called the reason this equilibrium doesn't happen is because the system works. The way it works is you have creative destruction. That's to say, you have industries that actually don't compete and go out of business as innovation happens. And that was coined by an Austrian economist called Joseph Schumpeter. He was born in Austria, but he came to Harvard. And in fact, he derived much of his ideas from Karl Marx. Because Karl Marx actually was the first one to actually talk about why these business cycles happen. Because he had some crude thinking, but he tried. And so you have this continuous reinvestment. So something will sell at a price, and then there'll be an innovation. So you never get to this equilibrium position. It's really controlled by what's being supplied. Now, in the financial world, there was a gentleman born in Chicago called Hyman Minsky. He studied under Schumpeter at Harvard, and he created the notion of financial destruction and the theory of financial instability. And this is what we've seen in a magnified. So the crashes really, big crashes that have happened, 1929, 1990, 2000, 2008, were all caused by financial bubbles, where sort of a madness takes hold and people just think, you know, these markets will go up forever. So they borrow and the banks lend. And one day, somebody wakes up and says, well, but there's no collateral. You can't pay this. And so the banks restrict credit, and of course the whole thing, the whole pile of cards, stack of cards, just crashes to the ground, and you have a crash. Now, I'd like to end with the notion of what's wrong with Say's law, which is this diagram here. Now, of course, Say's law says supply will always equal demand. Well, so let's look at that. Here I have this, the whole economic engine of a country, the whole gross national product, which takes labor materials and of course produces a supply, which are goods and services. Now, for this, you have an output or demand of money, but the materials have to be paid for and the labor has to be paid for. And so, if it's paid directly, then it goes into spending, which is part of this demand curve. Another fraction, of course, is saving. Is saved, people save, and also you get profits. So this, of course, goes by the banks, and this adds together the two things. Now, what happened was with this Say's law, in a closed economy, yes, indeed, the whole thing flows round and is in equilibrium. But that is not today's world. So part of this spending goes off to pay for the trade deficit. Also, part of this money that goes to the banks goes into what I've called CGT, because the casino world, where something like 3 to 4 trillion a day is spent gambling on the forex market, foreign exchange market. It goes into gold, which is non-productive, or it goes into tax havens, just disappears abroad. So if we work out mathematically how that works, this total demand equals the total income, which is the spending here, plus the bank investment, plus it has to pay for this trade deficit, plus it has to pay for this CGT. So we write it down here. So the total income equals the gross national product, which is this, plus this has to be paid for, which is the change in debt, right? Because to pay for it from one year to the next, you have to increase your debt. And like you don't pay for your credit card, it adds to the debt. So if you want to increase your income, which is this delta, increase in income, you have to increase the GDP, and then you actually have the differential squared of debt, which is debt acceleration. And when you have debt acceleration, it won't be paid for, and there's a crash. Now, many talks ago, I showed this debt acceleration, if this thing doesn't collapse. I'm going to find it. Here it is. Okay, this is the US public-private debt. This is the financial world. This is business. This is the federal government. And this is the household. You can see, starting in 1970, 2010 and beyond, that you've had an acceleration of debt. And so this has reached a point where, can't be paid for. And so that's why we have this huge crash. It's really, and this debt problem is something that doesn't factor into economic models. And so that ends my discussion of basically what's wrong socially, morally, economically, and so on, financially. This talks about what the problems are. In my first one of the talks I ever gave here, I talked about the solution to this, which is really economic democracy and a reform of all these systems, really. They just don't work, not in the way we've gone. And of course, it can't go on. You can't run up debt like this, accelerated. And I say you have acceleration of debt. Can't do it. So the politicians and the corporate world has been totally oblivious. They either don't care, don't know, and they don't care who pays the price. So, anyway, that concludes my talk for this evening. I'll invite your questions.
Any questions?
Yes.
Get my legs awake, I'll bring the mics.
Where's my beer?
Yes, John, I'll try to speak up loud enough for you. You can hear it.
Shut the mic, please. Get it on the sound.
Yes. Could you elaborate a little more in detail exactly how, the peasant classes, both there and here are waking up? Could you kind of go into that a bit more detail? I'm still, in other words, I'm still not seeing it maybe on the level that you are.
Okay.
To where they're waking up as specialists, since somebody say I can go down the street here and shoot somebody and not lose any things like this.
Well, no. What I'm saying is that the peasant class has really been duped by the notions that this neoliberal system will serve them, because what Theresa May is offering is this neoliberalism on steroids, and Trump is doing the same thing. Basically, he's saying, I'm going to offer you supply side economics, we're going to reduce taxes, we're going to do give the rich, basically reverse Robin Hood, take from the poor, especially you see this in England, reduce benefits, cuts and cuts and more cuts.
Yeah.
And so the wake up is when the people say, take in England, David Campbell, who was the Prime Minister then, said, because Nigel Farage, he ran the UKIP party, he said we should get out of Europe. I mean, he used to go to the European meetings and insult them all, saying they'd never done a day's work in their lives and they blah, blah, blah. Anyway, because of this mass immigration, because of the fact that the crash happened and their living standards were being reduced, finally, given a chance to vote, they said, to hell with it, we want out of this European system. Now, over here, it was only, you had Donald Trump and you had Hillary Clinton, okay? The reason why Hillary lost is because really, she had nothing to offer. She didn't say, now Trump went there and basically he said, I feel your pain, I understand you're losing jobs, and I'm going to bring them back. I'm going to make like the Reagan mentioned, I'm going to make America great again, you see. And that's a wonderful message, and people want to believe that. They need to believe that. In fact, it's all bullshit, is another question, right? It just doesn't work. And I've tried to show you what happens under this neoliberal, miasma. It doesn't work. Okay?
Yeah, I was wondering, but are they waking up to his message?
Well,
that's not true.
Well, what I'm saying is, what I'm saying is, they've woken up to the wrong message again.
Okay.
That's why basically, they're the peasant class, because they're not, wise enough or educated enough to understand what's really going on. I mean, you know, if
I understand.
if I talked about this to them, you know, this is not difficult stuff, you know, to see what happens. No one presents it like this as far as I know. But I see this in the UK and I see it here for the same result. We're not collectively in England and paying our way into the world. Simple as that. When you don't pay, it's like running up your credit card debt. There's a day of reckoning, and it's not good.
Is he the last straw, though? Is he the last straw? And I'll shut up.
Yeah. Okay, Ray, fire away.
You keep mentioning about a crash. Are you implying that you think that we are set up for one?
Yeah, I do. I do.
That was all.
Yep.
Concerning an awakening, I think that, I don't know to how much of an extent, but that definitely is an awakening on a lot of different things. Do you think it is possible, particularly given, as you stated, that Americans are so well armed, that there could be enough awakening, and particularly with our American military behind it, who are, I think, pretty aware of things, that we might do like Iceland did and throw the government out, elect a new government, and start putting those damn bankers in prison?
One could only hope, actually. I just don't. You know, the bank has got away with it. They got away with it. You know, they basically robbed it. You know. Well, look, you. I don't know if you read my famous book. I talk about the cozy money cartel, right? Money club. And of course, you know, look who was in charge of the Treasury Secretary. He was Paulson. Geithner was in charge of the Federal Reserve of New York. Okay. And they poured money by quantity into the banks. And what did the banks do with it? They passed a law that the federal deposits would pay interest, so you could borrow money next to nothing, put it back into the Fed, and get huge amounts of interest, you know, without risk. I mean, it was a wonderful system for bailing out the banks, but it's certainly, you know, the real problem is that America has underinvested for years, really. It's underinvested in its people, education. It's underinvested in having a proper healthcare system. And it's underinvested in the housing. And it's underinvested in having a proper economic work environment where, well, you know, I proposed a system years ago to Oracle. My simple view was everyone contributes to the bottom line. You know, even the janitor must contribute somehow to the bottom line. And I proposed a system how you could work that out. Of course, it was never accepted, but that's what I think. So everyone, in some way, contributes to the economy. Now, what's happened, as I explained with these CEOs, they robbed the economy blind. Well, actually damaging it, doing things that damage it. So, you know, this is why I talk about economic democracy. This is why I talk about spending on creating businesses. I mean, years ago I wrote a book called Small Business Startup Manual and a business profitability data, because I said, well, if I were to start a business, what would be the most profitable one? So I went to Robert Morris Associates, who published all the data, and went through the whole, about 400 different businesses working out the profitability. So, you know, that's where I come from. We need more businesses. We need to ensure that every person that wants to work works, and not have this massive army of unemployed people, which leads to crime, which leads to drugs, which leads to massive incarceration and social distress. That's what it leads to. It leads to societies really falling apart. And my fear is that if it gets bad enough, there will be a revolution. You know, it really will be. because you can only push people so far. So, and they are angry. I mean, I don't think the politicians realize how desperate and angry the ordinary working people who've lost jobs, homes, and careers and families are, really. You know, we live down here in a relatively prosperous area, but you go up north to the Rust Belt and whole cities are shrinking. I mean, Detroit shrinks. Boarded up houses. I mean, you've kind of, you know, on this altar of globalization and greed, driven by these people who are sociopaths, in my judgment, should never be allowed to run anything. Okay, John?
I'm going to challenge your perspective on a few things here, and I'll try to do it in several questions if I
Okay,
get an
far away.
opportunity to. As far as how corporations come by their profit, my understanding of how corporations work is they will nominally set a level of profit they expect, but then if they have extra expense, they will simply pass that on to the customer. So really, it's a situation where, and here's where I'm challenging you.
Mm-hmm.
Sometime back, a 25% tax was put on American corporations. They all left. They all went abroad. Now, if Trump comes in and says, okay, we're going to do a 15% tax on corporations because we want all their rear ends back here. If it in fact brings them back here, then how did we lose? How did the little man, so to speak, especially if you figure how corporations figure their products. If they have a lower expense that they have to put out and they're brought back here, how is that going to bump up their profits or hurt the little man?
Well, you see, you're working on the proviso that this corporation tax outweighs the cost benefit of super cheap labor overseas. That's what you're saying. See, basically you're saying, you know, this corporation tax acts as a tariff barrier. And so, you know, what the other point is, of course, when they go overseas,
But they're not
so
paying the 25% tax now because they left.
well, sure, they left because, as I said, because of labor arbitrage. So now you think or you say.
Well, I'm
let's not-
asserting from my point
No,
of view
no,
that they
I
were
understand.
bumped out of here by the high tax.
No, they weren't. Well, I don't think tax had much to do with it because, in fact, look at. In fact, I could go through these tables here. What you've seen since the 50s is corporate tax in general. It's been lowered down and down and down. Okay. Now I think you could lower it to 0%, and they'd still leave. Because it would be cheaper, even if you gave them no tax. They could still make more money by going overseas.
So you don't think the president's arm twisting is going to work at all?
Not really. Why would it?
Some of the CEOs of these corporations have pledged they're coming back.
Well, you know, some may well come back. That is true. You know, Germany, for example, goes to a completely different route. Okay, it basically says the management and the workers. In fact, if you look at BMW, the head of the trade unions, in fact, is on the board. You know, I think he's co-chairman with the CEO. You know, they have a much more togetherness spirit of working, whereby they all want benefits together. Now, when you have a system, which is what's going on in this country, where basically the CEOs have looted the company and the top officers, and the benefits to the work have gone down and down and down. And you have a healthcare system that's atrocious, where the costs have gone up and up and up, and that's so really this whole scheme. And I'll tell you why the single payer system is so good. It's because the cost of service, the benefits of it are so good. Now, so you may say, well, a government-run scheme is inefficient. My goodness, it can be much more inefficient, and still be a monopoly situation run by a private company.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Do you think if the Republicans, I believe, won't let this happen, but closing the loopholes in the tax code that allow corporations to stash their assets overseas but yet still take deductions and write-offs here?
Well, you see
What do you think?
Okay, let's examine what goes on in the city of London. Okay, it turns out that Britain lost an empire, but gained a huge mini empire in tax havens. I mean, all these little islands, Bermuda, Cayman Islands, and so on and so forth. Now, if you are a chief executive, you can get your pay paid anywhere in the world. And so you can go to the tax accountants, and you can have a company set up. Your name never shows up. So your money can be placed in this business entity based in, say, the Cayman Islands. You can then buy property around the world under a trust situation. You're home free. Now, the idea of bringing it back, is the last thought in their mind. I mean, it's the incentives for cheating and criminality is so beneficial that, now, I just don't believe in the goodness of this system. I mean, and that's one of the problems of this system. It has no moral value.
You were mentioning Joseph Schumpeter, but I couldn't deduce what of his view or what of his insight you were presenting.
Oh, I said that he introduced the notion of creative destruction. You see, I mentioned the fact that this Adam Smith pre-market deal always said that things would always tend to an equilibrium. And I'm saying, look, it never does, because of the fact you have this factor of creative disruption. You always have new products, you have product differentiation, you have the lack of knowledge between buyers and sellers, so there never is an arm's length transaction. I mean, I could go on, poking holes in this for hours, but what I'm telling you, the real bottom line is it does not work. The US and the UK are up to their eyeballs in debt. They have to sell their assets to pay for it. And look at America. Look at the companies you think are American aren't American. Like Trader Joe's shows up, it's owned by Aldi, right?
Who is Aldi?
Well, Aldi's a supermarket chain.
I know that, but who owns Aldi?
Oh, there are two brothers. There's Aldi Sud and Aldi Nord. Now it turns out that the Aldi, I think, is owned by Aldi Sud, and Trader Joe's is owned by Aldi, the different brother. So what I'm saying is that what you're seeing is this massive and slow sellout and takeover of US business. And once Margaret Thatcher got going, privatizing everything, when you privatize a monopoly, which is what the water company, I mean, like the city of Dallas is owned by the city, but if it ever sold off, it would be such a, I'd like to buy it. Such a, the profits made is, wonderful. I mean, you don't lose money because it's something people have. You make a fortune. I make a bid for it any day. But that's what privatization of these public assets do. But as I say, I mean, look, I think, as I said before, it needs top to bottom reform in this country. It's just not working. I don't care what you say, John, it ain't working.
Okay, well, let's go back to another, what I feel, presumption here. You mentioned Karl Marx.
I did.
Can we talk about the planks? of the Communist Manifesto?
Well, I'm not, look, what I mentioned.
I'm asking if we could discuss them, and
Oh,
I'm
well,
going to
no,
discuss them.
I don't advocate state ownership as a whole, but I think that some things should be state-owned because they are natural monopolies.
But that wasn't actually my comment.
Well,
My
I'm
comment
only
was
making a
that
point.
plank number 6 or something like
Plank
that.
6 of my retributions, yes, carry on.
No, it's plank 6 of Marx's.
Oh, of Marx. Okay, well,
It was a central bank. Now here is the great dichotomy here, someone who is for the people yet is funded by bankers like Engels and others. And every time communism has been implemented, it seems the bankers have been backing it, promoting it. And I'm like, okay, well, what's the key here? So what's your comment on that?
Well, you must have banks, okay? I mean, banks are a necessary evil. It's just a question, though, of what they're in business for. Now, in the old days, banking was simple. It was 363. You know what 363 is? You borrow money at 3%, you loan it out at 6%, and at 3 p.m. you're on the golf course. I mean, it's a simple proposition. You know, but the main factor of a bank is to concentrate wealth and aid in promoting business and prosperity. Okay. Now, when it engages in wholesale gambling, which is what these banks do, after the repeal of the Glass-Steagall especially, you know, they're not only draining the investment resources, but they do all kinds of things like finance takeovers, which in fact destroy wealth. They fund all kinds of financial engineering and so on, which is always beneficial to a few, the 1%, but destroys companies. My argument is that this whole system is counterproductive in an economic sense. It just doesn't work. And the proof of the pudding is every year now we're getting deeper and deeper as a country, and UK too, deeper and deeper into debt, and it all has to be paid for. So
are we in worse shape than UK, or are they worse shape than?
No, UK is in worse shape because because this privatization, you see, like ARM, there's a company called ARM, ARM, came out of Cambridge University. It sells the design of chips for all cell phones, okay? And one of our major economic assets, a month or two back, it was sold to the Japanese. So, this is economic madness, really. So because the Japanese, of course, buy the technology, they'll gradually take it to Japan, and so because the only way countries like the West can support this high standard of living is by innovation, is by having an educated populace. Okay. Now, when you destroy it, when you're sort of destroying the chicken that lays the golden egg, it's madness. So, that's really the whole theme of what I've talked about for years. This is why my book, Sabotaging America, was written, because I believe America has been sabotaged deliberately by the 1%. And what I'm saying to our friend at the back, the people have woken up, but they're very angry, and of course they bet on Trump to be their savior, just as they did with Ronald Reagan. Well, he wasn't, and Trump won't be. I mean, Trump is an economic ignoramus and a completely failed businessman. Now, how on earth you'd ever think he would do anything is beyond me. It's just no. What is lacking are people that care about the country, that will actually get into parliament, government, and actually care about the whole country. I mean, I used to row in an 8, okay, on the Thames in my college when I was in high school. Now, you win races when actually, every year in London, there's a head of the river race, 400 crews take part. It's very spectacular, all the colours of the colleges and private companies as well. You can listen to the first 10 crews coming that win, and you can hear them, the precision, you get crack, crack. Now, they win because they're synchronized, they're all pulling together. It's the same with any operation. When you have things a detriment to economic benefit, you can't win races. And this country and England too are not winning what I call the economic competitive race. Germany doesn't do such things. You know. Now Germany, I don't want to go into it, but they have an entirely different educational system, entirely different banking system, entirely different corporate system, you know, and it works. They run it. They make. I don't think German goods are as good as their bills. In fact, you know, I've had some of them. And they have, you know, engineering defects, but never mind. I mean, they actually do make the stuff, the modern stuff. And in England these days, I mean, Dyson, you know, made the vacuum cleaner. You know, he said he couldn't. There's not the supply chain to buy stuff in England anymore, because all the little supply manufacturers aren't gone.
Do you think the reason that Germany has a better education system, as you say, is because of what they're teaching?
Well,
are we
actually,
teaching a bunch of material that nobody can make a living with?
Yeah. In Germany, you have the academic stream and the technical stream, and they both carry equal weight. So you're not pressured. You know, you're not better if you do, you know, go and learn ancient Greek, or if you go and learn, you know, how to design and manufacture a part, you know, technically speaking. And really speaking, the question is what I would say is, what value are you to society when you get done? If you can, you know, spot well, if you can paint, if you can do anything with your hands, that's valuable. I mean, that's real economic benefit. You know, the fact you want to do ancient Greek, well, that's nice, you know, but you know, and no doubt it has a value. But when you so skew things that you believe you can rely upon this cheap immigrant labor, or you can send all your business overseas and it will make sense, it simply does not. It just doesn't work. And this massive debt shows, and you know, this accelerated. And I explained, you know, mathematically why this happened. And there it is. There's not one, you know, check it out. And then I gave this talk, what, 2 or 3 years ago. I've never really changed my tune, so to speak. Every now and then I just revised it, reheat it, but it makes more. Anyway, sorry, Albert.
No, that's okay. Do you think if we got up the gumption to do what we should have done a long time ago, and throw out the GATT and NAFTA treaties that Bush and Clinton got in, that we could go back to tariffs, that if Toyota sent over a Model X that was about the same thing as the Chevrolet Y, it wouldn't sell for a whole lot less. They'd put the tariff on it to bring it up to even. Well, that's what the tariffs were all about. Wouldn't that bring all the companies back?
Actually, my remedy is something I've gone over many times, is Keynes' proposal, which he made at Bretton Woods, which is balanced trade by a mechanism which I've given talks on, okay, which is really, I'll just go over it if you want quickly. What he said was there would be an international currency called the Bancor. And so you take the trade deficit with China. Well, so when you exchange goods internationally, you pay for it in the Bancor, right? Just like you used to pay for it in gold. Well, in the gold world, when it was gold, you paid for your debts in gold. Now, if you had a trade deficit, you pay in gold, and gradually one day you'd run out of gold. Right? So that would all, and because your money is tied to gold, your money would become more and more worthless. So it would stop it. Well,
it's doing that anyway.
What Keynes proposed was the Bancor. Now, what he said, say take China. China has a huge surplus with America. So what would happen is at the end of a period, the Chinese currency would up value by 5%, American dollar would decrease by 5%. So American goods would become cheaper, Chinese goods would become more expensive. So that way you would force a balance of trade. Okay, that's what he proposed. Now, the benefit is many.
Now, was that done with the value of the currency?
Yeah, your currency, because you're not paying your way. You see. So now that he proposed that at Bretton Woods, and it was nixed by Harry Dexter White and Morgenthau. Okay, so America shot itself in the foot actually over it, and in fact Britain was a disadvantage as well, because I won't go over it, but they were. So had King's proposal been accepted, you would have automatic stability of trade, which must be, because you can't run trade deficits forever. It's not possible without, as happening, selling off all your assets to pay for it. It's really rather simple. I mean, if you're trading and offering your collateral, you can't pay, you get rid of it. Anyway, carry on, John. Next question.
You made the comment that the free market has no social conscience.
Correct.
And I'm trying to figure out how a program with social conscience is always taking money out of my back pocket. Can you please explain?
There is such a thing as society. Now, in this world, money, there are other values than money, okay? There is such a thing as social cohesion, happiness, contentment, and so on and so forth. Now, back in the day when St. Augustine wrote, he said that a rich man can be wealthy, but he must always use his wealth for social good. So that was prevailing ethic of that era. Now, when you say we don't care about the social good, we don't care who dies in the street, what happens is, basically, one day you have a French Revolution. That's what happens in the extreme, and it has happened. And if it goes on in this country as it's going, that's what will happen. You up here.
During the Depression, they came up with the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Right.
And so what they did, they put poor people to work, evidently.
Right.
But at that time, was there any type of welfare at all in, say, 35?
No, it didn't.
So that
unemployment benefits and all the rest, and Medicare didn't
and that's
exist.
what pulled us out of the.
Well, what actually pulled America out was huge deficit spending because of World War II. That's what pulled it out. In fact, as you know, in 1937, the Republicans said, you're overspending, you must cut spending. So they cut spending and went back into recession.
So the war helped us out, huh?
Absolutely.
God.
And I can say that England paid a heavy price for that. Because for 2.5 years, we paid to survive. Mostly we were buying food to survive, and the U-boats and whatnot were sinking as much as they could. The war material that America had to offer was virtually worthless for years. First, up until about 1943, it didn't really have a proper tank. It didn't have proper airplanes, so on and so forth. Now, fortunately for the Russians, they had the T-34 as a superior tank even to the Germans. If Britain or the French had a T-34 and Katyusha rockets, they could have stopped the Wehrmacht in 1940, but they didn't. So, no, basically all I'm saying is, yes, I think that, well, look, you can run an industry under coercion, okay? You can say, I'm the boss, you do this, and otherwise, Now, that sort of punishment regime, which seems to be quite prevalent, does not work, okay? Especially as the people get more educated, especially when, you know, I used to have team meetings, and every team meeting I would say, okay guys, tell me what's going on, tell me what's going wrong. Because I don't know everything, and you're the guys, you're the engineering specialist, you know what's going on. Tell me, if something's going wrong, I want to know right away, and we'll fix it. And because they trusted me, because okay, as I said, as my father used to say, a man who's never made a mistake has never done anything. Okay? We all make mistakes. We all forgetful, especially as we get older. And so you must forgive. I mean, there's a moral to business. You know, there's a moral component. And if you think, pursuit of maximum profitability and greed, is a moral component, I don't think so. I don't think anybody in his right mind would think so. It doesn't work. It does not work. I think, look, I get regarded as a fool because when I help people, I give money, I say, look, don't pay, you can't pay, fine, pay me when you can. Okay, I'm not a fool. That's my ideology. Okay, it's called being a Christian. That's what it is. And I think that notion of how you view people and you run a whole country works. I think this super greed that I've demonstrated does not work. It demonstratively does not work. We've had a 30-year experiment in neoliberal economics, and it's been a disaster.
Well, John, if I could sum up, your entire lecture is it's not working.
That's right.
Okay.
It ain't working, folks.
I am definitely applauding you on your personal charity, but I have problems about extending that into national programs, especially when we're talking about health care. We have over 200,000 deaths in this country now in the healthcare system from the misapplication of medicine and also in the application of medicine and the prescription of supposedly regulated drugs. So we have a major problem. I know, the amount of deaths from car fatalities across the country actually has gone down over the last few decades. And the question is...
Okay, question, yes, please.
Okay, one of the parliament members in Canada actually disclosed last week that the Canadian healthcare single-payer system is bankrupt. And and in this country we have reports that Obama was borrowing millions out of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to bolster Obamacare. So my question is, does it work?
I tell you this, the national healthcare system is treasured by the majority of British people. It does work. It really does work. The thing is, there's a different ethic by the people. People actually are proud to work in a system whereby they're actually helping people. They're actually giving service. They're not there to money grub and maximize profit, okay? I have a new doctor, okay? I used to have an ancient doctor who retired. A new doctor comes in. He's got all new equipment. And I'm putting every damn kind of a test you could imagine. Heart motors and echo sounds and I don't know what. He's trying to pay off his, his practice, okay? We've seen it with a new dentist. You go there and, boy, you need 5,000 fillings and like goodness knows what,
That's called mining for gold. Right.
Now, one of my experiences during the war was, during the war we evacuated from London, and my uncle came back from the Middle East, and he passed on scabies to me, okay? So I was very ill. And so the doctor came out from, it was private, and he was charging my mother what was a whole weekly wage. And I was being given this ointment that burnt and so on. Well, a year or so later, I was thin and never got it. So, a year later, my uncle came back, had a fit, because he realized there was penicillin ointment that would cure things right away. You know, this pursuit of money and greed, really, you know, as opposed to people, you know, this world is all about people. You know, it's not about amassing tons of money. I mean, what are you going to do if you become get a billionaire and $2 billion? I mean, what the hell are you going to do with it? I mean, it's absurd. So look, all I'm saying is things work much better if you care about people, if you actually believe in them, if you give them responsibility and you reward them. I mean, that's the way it works in this world. You know. So I think you know, that's the, you know, if you want, that's my ethical standing, really. I think helping people, not abusing people, giving them responsibility, and putting everyone back to work, having a system where everybody who wants to work can work. That's what I recommended. I don't want to see people unemployed. I'd rather pay them to start businesses, to do something, to invent something. I would rather a guy in college who invents something, you pay him to develop it, and so on. Yes?
Was the Civilian Conservation Corps, anybody that wanted to work, could they work, or was that limited in some way?
Well, as I understand it, it was, you know, people, you know, it was set up so if you wanted to join it and work, yeah, you would send, yeah. So I mean, look, the living proof. Go down to San Antonio, and our whole Riverwalk was built in that period by that corps.
Thank you. That's my hometown.
Yeah, and you know, as you know, it's one of the best investments that were ever made, right?
Yeah.
It's called investing in the city, investing in the community. Okay. And it's a wonderful place. I loved going down there. And that was done during that period with that self-same program. So, you know, now would private enterprise have done all that? I doubt it, because it at the time it wouldn't have made money. And so you see, you know, look, we invest in our kids because the kids are, you know, our future. Okay, it's not a noble act. It's, you know, it's really an act of economic, you know, positiveness. It makes sense. Okay, to have the most educated, most employed population going. In fact, you see, you do away with a lot of these welfare costs and stress of illness and so on. If you decide to, you know, have a program of putting people back to work as a national priority, and not hoping that as in England, you know, you cut and you say we have to do it because we can't pay anymore. Well, you know, if you go, right.
Oh, one question. You have such great ideas, John. Have you ever, with other people, thought of opening a bank yourself?
You know, I've started several businesses with colleagues and so on. The most successful business I have is my marriage, okay? And, you know, I think my wife is wonderful, okay? I really do. And so I'm quite happy to focus my activities and my around, you know, my family and so on. And this doesn't mean I do down other people. No, I don't. And she doesn't. I mean, she's, you know, very friendly and helps people. You know, so, sorry, Albert. Oh.
John,
I think Jim wants to bring it to.
You wanna go to comments?
Oh, comments,
I've
okay.
already turned the mic off.
All right, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I just talk too much.
Well, as you know, John, we enjoy listening to you, and we enjoy asking questions to you. So I've let that run over about 30 minutes probably. So we're getting close to the finish line. We try to shut off at 9 o'clock. Once in a while, we run over a bit. But let's take time, and don't take 10 or 15 minutes, please. Come up and make a 5-minute comment. Let's do 4 of us. The first 4 people who come up, make a comment, and then John gets to make whatever closing statement he wants to make, and we'll shut it off for today. Okay? Carry on. You get out of the way.
Well, John, I enjoyed the presentation.
Yeah.
And you covered a lot of material, and I'm not sure that I don't. But I want to just make a couple comments in what I think. I'm not disagreeing with anything you said. We are experimenting with stuff that doesn't work. And when we lose, like most of the multinational corporations, they're not concerned about the national interest of the United States. They're concerned about their bottom line. And many of those companies are internationally owned, as well as Americans. And that's part of the problem. Like Tom says, the people with money get what they want, and other people really don't. They don't consider what we need to do. I agree that education, I don't condemn our higher education system as much as some people do. I was part of both the elementary, secondary, public schools, and public universities. I think they try to teach students to think, but we have a kind of a system in the United States that the thinkers were supposed to go to the Ivy League schools. The public universities was for the people to be taught to work, to do a job, not think. And in some states like Texas, we created Texas Christian University, Southern Methodist University, Rice University, and others for those the affluent people's children who couldn't go to the Ivy League. They could go there, and they would teach them to think. Fortunately, the universities have moved beyond that, and we try to teach people how to think and how to operate in a very dynamic, changing economic environment. So I know the German system, I think, is better because in about middle school, you make a decision where you're going through the academic track or the technical track. And Germans, for many years, were considered to be highly technical people. In fact, people that helped us develop the atomic bomb, many of those came from Germany. So I'm not criticizing them. I think the universities try to do the best they can. But I think the big problem facing America is we're too polarized. Too polarized, and we all have greed. If I don't watch myself, I'll be greedy. But I try to be focused on not being just concerned about greed. When I retired, I probably could have earned a lot of money because I had a living. And when you got a living, you can speculate and be successful. But I chose to do the social thing, try to work with private and nonprofit organizations so they could better serve people. But that was a decision I made. And I think more people need to make that decision. We look at welfare, and we look at Social Security, Medicare, and health insurance. Well, I work for public health, and I have a pretty good idea how the health system works in the United States. It's not government run, it's private run. The bills are paid by carriers and medium, Blue Cross Blue Shields, and other companies. The federal government have rules and ways they're supposed to operate. It's not, the Affordable Care Act is not run by the federal government. The claims are paid by private insurance companies. They develop policies where it should work. So we need to sometimes be a little bit more discerning of what we read, what we see, and what we think. If we do, I think we'll come up with a different thing. But when people are all over the place and as polarized as we are in this nation, we have a group of people in the United States, as long as minorities suffer more than they do, they're okay. They're willing to suffer some, but as long as they feel they're suffering less than minority people. And if we can't get beyond that, we are morally corrupt. And that's what I think we're talking about. And we are morally corrupt because we aren't concerned about it. And you know, you look back in the history just 40 years ago, 40 or 50 years ago, I could only get certain jobs. And so they made some changes in that, but it's still, you got to be very aggressive or you won't be too successful. So I think we need to think about what can we do to help everybody? How can we create a level playing field? Because we create a crutch for many people because it's so challenging. They say, I can't do it, they become a crutch, and the prisons are full, and all those kind of things that we have in America. But those of us who are trained need to think ourselves a little better and not think so narrow. Thank you.
Well, I wish to thank John for the very erudite presentation here. Before I say that I believe it's a complete misunderstanding of the issues, the situation I think could be described kind of a George Carlin quote, if you pick a fight with reality, you're gonna lose. Now, having a benign experience with a form of socialism after World War II or during World War II does not to me constitute a continuing endorsement for socialism or a socialistic way of approach. And I would agree when you're talking about oligopolies. I would remind, I've said this before at the mic, I was corresponding with a man in Holland, and we had a discussion about conspiracy theories. And he said there in Holland they had gotten together and they had done an intensive investigation into who was controlling things in the world. And he found out that all the top 100 corporations had members on their board from the House of Orange, and he said, we concluded there is no conspiracy. And so the issue of oligopoly is a big issue. And I understand John's feelings of compassion. I certainly am compassionate in my finances to the extent I can be. Sometimes my bill collectors have to wait a bit while I'm being compassionate, but the solution I don't think lies with socialism or with the socialistic system. There is something about free market economics that is kind of its own check and balance. Where we have gotten into trouble here in this country is with government subsidies. You look at someone like an H. Ross Perot. Ross Perot made his fortune on government subsidies, government programs. So many of the top corporations and entities we're talking about, they did what they did with the help of our dear legislators. They got special consideration for their business. They didn't have to pay this tax, or they got a pass on this regulation. And I think it's coming to a point, it's a very complex issue from one perspective, but in another perspective, I think we're almost back to a kind of a Magna Carta moment, if you will. Now I resent the designation of peasant. Somehow or other, as an American citizen, I feel more like a gentry than a peasant. And I think it is time for us to, in the aggregate, not collectively, but in the aggregate, come together and put the sword to the king, figuratively, and inform that this is not acceptable. This country is purportedly founded on the rule of law and not the rule of man. Yet I don't think we've been ever farther down a period where we have the rulership of men. I can't remember all the names here, but wasn't it Corzine who gambled with 40 billion of people's investment money or something like that, and a huge amount. Jamie Dimon basically told him, you're going to send 2 billion over here to, what was his company at the time? Chase something or other. Basically, you're going to be feeding the fishies. I mean, you know, there were words exchanged. Amazingly enough, I don't believe Corzine went to jail at all. All the big players. Did bankers go to jail? Can you remember a banker going to jail in this country? When are we going to rise up and follow the example of Iceland and go after these predatory creatures, especially in the banking realm and in some of the other industries, and put the sword to them and say, no, hell no, not anymore. And I think that is the solution. I think that is absolutely much more compassionate.
Don't walk off with my talk there.
I made an attempt.
Yes.
Okay.
You've got it on tape anyways.
I do have it on tape.
Right.
One more?
You can look up Joan Vion on the internet. She did a study for years and years and years of the United Nations, going to a lot of their conferences and so forth. And she first disclosed to the public this public-private partnership thing that the elitists are trying to push on people, where all of the utilities go into public hands and so forth. Sounds good, sounds like free enterprise. It's not, it's fascism. That's exactly what it was designed to be and what it is being. And when I look at human history as I see it, and I have a fairly good education, not the best in the world, but a fairly good one, I more and more see that the larger we become in population on this world, the less controllable we are by the people who have good intentions, and the more controllable we are by those who pull the strings at the top. Because it's hard for us as individuals to have anything to do with an organization like the town hall meetings that New England had years ago. We can't do that anymore. The city councils and the county commissioners, they don't give a tinker's damn about what you come down there on the little public presentation days and have your 3 minutes once a month to present something. They're on their computers and chit-chatting. They just don't give a damn. It's all for show. And that right there, at this level, of course, this is not a small city. It's totally out of control of the people. There is no control for the people. So I think at this point in the low moral and spiritual development of humanity, regardless of 300 or 3,000 Christian churches, which indicates there's a huge fragmentation of understanding there, I think that the best that I have seen, I didn't see it personally, but I met the Moriartys and went to their lectures about Libya. The best that I've seen is that Gaddafi, who went in there as a militant dictator to stop the warring of the two major tribes in his country and bring peace to that country, and then create a tribal council, which was in essence their Congress, so that they solved their issues by discussion and so forth. And then the confiscating of the oil industry, which really made the Hunt brothers mad. And then the taking over of the banking system and putting Libya on a gold-backed dinar, so it's not the fiat money of the Rothschild international banking system, i.e. Federal Reserve being part of that. That made that country go from the poorest country in Africa to the wealthiest, most peaceful country in Africa, where everybody had equal rights. Blacks, whites, whatever color you were equal. Women, men, women there in that country could rise to any position in a corporation they qualified for, could start and own their own companies, drive their own cars, didn't have to wear burqas, any of that stuff. And all the freedoms were there for the black Africans as well, until the CIA paid and armed Al-Qaeda rushed in to create that invasion, and they just started killing all the black people immediately.
30,000.
They killed 650,000 Libyans in that out of, what was it, like 5 or 6 million, and 2 million left the country and fled as refugees. But Gaddafi had it going, and he went against the banking system. That was his major death knell. And he went against that oil cartel. I personally think that the United States, if we could get ourselves together, should nationalize the oil industry and use that money for the people. In Libya, 49% of that oil income went to run everything in the government, including free education for everybody. No matter how many PhDs you wanted to get in England or France or wherever you wanted to go, they paid for it. They paid the transportation. They sent your family with you, and there was a couple in London who were he was getting a PhD. They paid the rent and gave him $7,000 a month. Same with medical, anywhere in the world, and they would send a family member with you. This was a nation under a man who had a hell of a lot of loving compassion for humanity. Far more Christian in his behavior than anything I see in this country, except a few of the very beneficial organizations, like a lot of those that take care of stray animals. I love those organizations. But we need to back up and regroup and think, who the hell do we really think we are and what we are? What are we putting into practice? Jesus said, "Judge me not by my words, but by my works." And I don't see much of that going on. I don't see the works very much in this country. I'm not as proud of being an American as I used to be years ago when I still believed in Santa Claus. And I think that we've all still been believing in Santa Claus. And we need to do, like John said, stand up like the Icelanders did and throw the bankers out. That's the most evil organization on earth, other than international Satanism, which is a big, well-organized organization. And we need to stop throwing these little slurs at people and saying, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist." Because if you do that, you're sound asleep. The conspiracies in this world are far greater than what we think our realities are. Far greater. And it goes from every subject you want to think of someone of being nuts on. Look up what a lot of the astronauts have said about UFOs and aliens on the internet. Conspiracy theorist and nut. In any event, there's a lot more to that which is hidden than there is that which is truth in our minds, as we have been taught in our schools and brainwashed. And there's a great effort was put out to brainwash the students in this country with outcome-based education, book on that title. And this is 5 minutes.
All right.
Don't close us out, John.
Okay. Well, I think I'll really end where I was going to, all along is, this system does not work. I think it's apparent mostly to everybody. Now, the question is, what elements of it do not work, and what do we do about it? What do we have solutions? Now, I've proposed some solutions, but I think that it behoves most people, most citizens really, to think about these things, to figure out themselves what they think does not work and why it doesn't work. And then start thinking and promoting what the solutions might be. Now, in England, next week we're going to have an election. We have had a typical season, on which about 4 weeks we spent next to nothing. But what has emerged actually is that some, like Jeremy Corbyn, who is a Labour Party leader who was vilified, actually has had a chance to get a hearing with some of his policies. And even though he was sneered at for being ill-dressed and illegitimate and a whole lot, surprisingly enough, many people agree with him now. They've heard his case. Now, so what I would say is that corporations like Xerox had managers that said, "Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions." So, now, if you're a leader, you better have a damn good idea what solutions are there and what you would do. What's your plan? Basically, so any politician needs to answer the question, what is your plan? What would you do? Now, I don't think, from what I've seen, many of these politicians have a decent plan for whatever reason. One reason, of course, is the 1% are quite happy. They think they're doing well, and they bought the process, so why should they change? Well, so I think, but there are the 99% or so, or perhaps even more than 99%, that really are supposed to have the voice. It's a question of, will they get sufficiently interested, sufficiently educated to stand up and join a debate, a rational debate about what would you do. And I do think that social cohesion, really, the stuff that Calvin's talked about, is a severe problem and a starting point for America. I think rather than a lot of this divisiveness that's gone on, really one religion against another religion, one race against one club, we just see this total divisiveness everywhere. And it's got to the point where it's me too and damn everybody else. Well, that doesn't work. So I just say to people, think, act, and preach, as I do.
Well, I'm not going to give a Tom speech at the end of the meeting here tonight, but I'm just going to close this out and remind you next week to come in here. Alan Brunson, I believe his name is. And tonight we've looked at a lot of the serious issues we are being faced with. We're trying to figure out ways to deal with. And that's just a necessary part of our life and our economy. Next week, I think we could sort of turn off our switches a bit, because listen to his title again. On lessening your stress and increasing your cognitive ability